Light years away from the small-time swindlers who are more than happy with a bit of easy money are the white-collar criminals who, over several years, managed to accumulate astronomical illegal gains. The weapons they use systematically are psychology, persuasion, and seduction.
Today, we live in a show business society, an atmosphere in which an imposter is totally in his element.
Imbued with his own self-esteem, the imposter's motivations often surpass any type of rationale.
For him, it's a sort of a game. Of course, the eventual profits are tempting, but at a certain point, the temptation doesn't amount to very much. Is money the real motivation behind all swindlers or imposters? I think it's actually what the money represents.
New York, December the 11th, 2008. The FBI arrests one of the world's most highly respected financiers, accused of mounting an enormous scam, Bernard Madoff, the man worth $50 billion.
Madoff's arrest made the front page. CNN almost immediately did a story about the FBI's surprise arrest of financier Bernard Madoff. We were in a period of financial crisis, and every day brought more bankruptcies. And yet, Madoff's victims kept saying they weren't worried because their money was safe with him and that they could get it back. They had no idea that the tons of money that they had entrusted to him were all gone. People were ruined from one day to the next, and they wanted Madoff's head.
Although the 19th and 20th centuries had their fair share of more or less spectacular financial scams, that of the 21st century, engineered by Bernard Madoff, was the most explosive of all.
He's manipulative. He uses his ability to connect well with people as a way of also trying to get his own agenda across.
People that generally were going into Wall Street started the major firms. They came from families of privilege. They also went to some of the top schools. And so this is what ushered in their career into the securities industry. Madoff didn't have that.
In order to understand how this gigantic swindle could have lasted for more than 20 years and concerned so many people, it's important to delve into the psychology and the motivations behind this extraordinary criminal. We will do so thanks to exclusive interviews with individuals who had contact with Madoff over several years. Among them, Eugene Soltes, a professor of management at Harvard University, who has published a book dealing with white-collar criminals and who recorded numerous conversations with Madoff.
Starting from scratch type of entrepreneurial type of enterprise where, you start out not exactly, at least in my part, not exactly sure what I wanted to do in life other than be a success.
Unlike many of the cases of fraud, he knew his victims. These were family, these were friends, these were members of the Jewish community. So they were intimately close individuals that he was ultimately harming. And so that's really different from a lot of other cases of white-collar crime in which the victims that are actually harmed by these executives are distant and far away, and the executive doesn't really have to see them or know them in order to cause the harm to them.
His arrest took place during a financial crisis after the most colossal bankruptcy in Wall Street history, the failure of Lehman Brothers. The Madoff debacle was the straw that broke the camel's back. The following day, he was released on bail. Both small and large investors were speechless as journalists were ready to lynch him. Colleen Aaron corresponded with Madoff for more than 4 years and is preparing a book on the subject.
Madoff coming out of his apartment, and the media was surrounding him so tightly that they got into his space and they pushed him back to get the shots.
What would you say to them?
So the media often described the anger of the investors as rage. There was this baying mob kind of crowd mentality that they wanted blood, they wanted a lynching. You had this man who was the face of Wall Street there, who was evil. They camped outside of his penthouse with signs that said, "Bernie, it's not too late, jump."
The press demonized him, comparing him to the Joker in Batman, and the effect of Madoff's unimaginable fraud on his victims was equivalent to an earthquake.
It was a tornado, and a hurricane, and a tsunami. Everybody just was stunned. that this had happened. They could not believe this guy who everybody seemed to think was trustworthy, had been doing this for so long, was a crook.
It was cataclysmic.
I want him to go into a jail cell, and I want him to sit there, and you know what, he shouldn't be sitting with his Apple computer, and he shouldn't be sitting in his $7 million penthouse apartment. We have people in our group who literally do not know where they're going to be living in 2 or 3 months. They have maybe 2 or 3 months of liquidity.
Helen Chaitman is a lawyer representing 300 of Madoff's victims. She also invested with Madoff and remembers the day he was arrested.
It's one of these moments that you'll never forget. It's like, where were you when the planes crashed into the World Trade Center? It was so shocking to think that I had just like that lost all of my savings. It took me a week or two before I could really deal with it. It was quite shocking.
We are going to enter Bernard Madoff's head in order to understand how he managed to defy the highest authorities in the American financial market. It's here, on 3rd Avenue, in the legendary Lipstick Building, that Madoff set up his investment fund. It was from these offices that he orchestrated one of the century's most gigantic scams. Day after day for 20 years, he succeeded in sucking in tens of thousands of victims. The fraud was based on a simple pyramid operation known as a Ponzi scheme, named after Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant who used the same procedure in the 1920s. Charles Ponzi, a penniless swindler, founded a finance company. His slogan was, "Lend me your money and earn 50% interest." Within a few weeks, 30,000 people entrusted him with $10 million. His immense newly acquired fortune aroused the suspicion of the press. Here's what the investigators discovered. He used the money received from his new investors to pay the older ones. It was the first finance chain, the Ponzi chain. But when there weren't enough new investors to pay dividends to the old ones, everything collapsed. Bernard Madoff employed the same technique, paying his clients regular revenues of more than 10% thanks to the money received from new arrivals.
I had 6 clients that had invested with Bernard Madoff. And they all, they didn't invest through feeder funds, they invested with him directly. The investments ranged from about $1.5 million was the smallest investment, or maybe $1.8 million, and the largest was about $75 or $80 million.
More than 10% in the world of finance is more than interesting, making certain wealth managers who had the possibility of meeting Madoff somewhat wary. One such manager met with him in 2005.
The funds manager noticed that there was a sort of sculpture in Madoff's office representing a screw. When he asked Madoff why a screw, he answered, "You know that screw is another word for the F word. And it's a screw because that's what I do. I screw people."
Because I screw people.
Palm Beach in Florida was where Madoff would go on weekends in search of new victims. This beach resort town for multi-millionaires is the epitome of chic and glamour, filled with palm trees, yachts, hotels and exclusive private clubs whose members were mainly retirees ready to invest in charities as well as investment funds.
It's a place where former Wall Street professionals spend their retirement years, and so Madoff's new recruits, in reality, had the same background as Madoff himself, although they were for the most part retired.
Palm Beach is an American Chamonix, Geneva, or Saint-Tropez, a sort of general representation of wealthy seniors who, in addition, were very community-minded, since they were an integral part of the Jewish community, an ideal hunting ground for Madoff.
Madoff quickly realized the benefits he could acquire by integrating this community. He enjoyed showing himself at palace hotels and clubs and using his reputation as a top-notch Wall Street financier. In Palm Beach, his nickname was Uncle Bernie.
Bernard Madoff was highly regarded and admired in Wall Street circles. He was an insider who knew the workings of the system. People would say, "Bernie's good. He knows stuff that we don't know." And he only swindled people he was close to, from the same community, and who had confidence in him.
It's what you'd call fraud by affinity, meaning that he swindled primarily, and with great success, the Jewish community. He swindled people he played golf with and people with whom he organized charitable operations. That was his great strength.
Madoff was a very fascinating person. The scope of his crime was so massive. He ended up having 64,000 people as victims. They either invested directly or they invested indirectly through feeder funds. He invested for many of the royal families in Europe, for many of the aristocratic families in Europe, and you have to ask yourself, how did this little Jewish man from New York manage to swindle so many people?
Madoff became a member of the Palm Beach Country Club, reserved for ultra-rich philanthropists.
The initiation fee was $400,000 to get in. And you have to demonstrate that you have given at least that amount of money to charity within the last 5 years, each year.
When you join a club, especially in the US, you immediately have everyone's confidence. It's a very open society, which allows you to join if you have a good reputation and a great deal of money. And he used this sort of social polish effectively to recruit his victims.
He's a captivating individual to be around. He's cordial, he's smart, he's brilliant, he's pleasant, he's nice in a lot of ways. We would enjoy a conversation with him. And he used all that to be able to take in more money.
In addition to swindling Florida millionaires, he also attracted celebrities tempted by the investment of the century, including Steven Spielberg, John Malkovich, and Elie Wiesel. How and with what techniques was he able to lure so many worldly wise personalities?
They were all telling each other how wonderful he was. So it wasn't even that Bernie Madoff had to convince all of these individual investors. They heard from each other. Hey, you have to get on Bernie's fund because he's producing 10 to 15%. He's wonderful. And this took place in synagogues. It took place in Palm Beach. It took place on Long Island. Whenever they needed to redeem their money, they got it back. So there was no red flag for many of them that this could be a potential scam.
And he always adopted the same strategy, flaunting his fund as being very exclusive, making his victim think he was a privileged person, and especially making himself inaccessible.
When you got to see Madoff, he'd always say that there was no place available for your investment, and that he therefore couldn't do anything for you, thus frustrating his future victims. During the second contact, however, he would say, "I might have a little place open if you still want to invest." Well, the client was happy, flattered, and willing to invest twice the original amount. And then he'd add, "Whatever you do, don't tell anybody."
If you tell anyone, whether it's a 4-year-old child, no, you can't have a lollipop, or a 40-year-old entrepreneur, no, I won't take your money and invest it, the recipient of that news becomes absolutely desperate. So that's how he persuaded people to invest with him.
He employed a very simple reflex. Every investor wants to make more money and with a return as consistent as possible.
He didn't go out and solicit people. People were throwing money at him around here. They all wanted to be part of this deal.
Although rich clients had direct contact with Madoff, more modest investors never even met him, but entrusted their money to financial firms that had invested with Madoff.
And I said, who is Bernard Madoff? And what does he have to do with me? And he said, well, all the money that you invested in this feeder fund was invested with Madoff, and it's all gone away. So that was a little upsetting. I lost $400,000. So I'm one of the smaller.
Stephen Greenspan was a collateral victim of the scam. Ironically, this psychologist had been working for years on the subject of credibility. He ended up losing a large part of his savings.
One of the clever things about Madoff, he didn't promise huge returns. 10% a year, that's forever. I mean, that's a very nice return. That's better than most investments, but it's not like some of these hedge funds might make 50% or 100% a year. No, he knew that the kind of people who he was taking advantage of would be suspicious about something like that. The fact that the returns were good but modest were attractive to them. So he was a good psychologist. Most successful con men are good psychologists. They know that people tend to be trusting, and they also know that people tend to be too polite to say, wait a minute, you're lying, I don't believe you.
The question is, well, how did he manage to bring these people into his investment scheme? What he always would tell people is that I can't take your money. I can't take any more. Now, at the time, it's because he probably genuinely couldn't take in any more money. And so that was, you could say, a legitimate way of saying, well, if you invest in me, I could lose everything because I can't take in any more money. So that protects him.
This self-protection technique managed to convince even his most intelligent victims.
The swindler or imposter also reveals the greed of his victim. So there's often a mirror image between the imposters and their prey. People need a form of recognition, and frequenting Madoff satisfied this need. They let themselves be swindled because they found what they were seeking.
Although his victims tried to capture Madoff's attention, Madoff had only contempt for them.
He doesn't have any feeling for the victims. His view is that whatever they got was more than they deserved.
Madoff confirms this in exclusive recordings from his jail cell in North Carolina.
It was the people that came in very late in the game that got hurt. Did I make a lot of money for people? Yeah, I made a lot of money for people. You know, did people lose profits that they thought they made? Yes. But did they lose capital? I'm sure, I'm confident that when this thing is all finished, very few people, if any, will lose their principal.
A cynical view of his victims. After all, he felt the very wealthy didn't invest all their money with him, so it wasn't that serious. And as for the most modest victims whom he ruined, he said, when you promise an annual return of 10%, there's obviously something wrong. They shouldn't have trusted me. It's a Machiavellian way of looking at it, without scruples or guilt feelings. I don't think you can be a successful swindler if you feel guilt.
Bernard Madoff has always been devoid of any remorse. But where does this swindler come from, and what circumstances motivated him to launch such a gigantic scam? He offers a few elements of the answer from his prison cell.
Because of my beginnings and because I was having to have been in a business that was hard to break into, in a sense that it was controlled pretty much by, you know, the establishment. And I clearly was an outsider of that establishment, not coming from, you know, money, or not certainly coming from even a connected family.
Madoff was born in 1938 into a modest family of Eastern European immigrants. He resented not coming from a wealthy environment, which would have enabled him to attend an elite university and to have important connections.
His background is largely unremarkable as far as his childhood and teenage years. You know, he grew up in a lower middle class family in Queens. He went to a public school. He was largely liked. He was a member of the swimming team, had good relationships with the girls. but I don't think there were any indicators at that point that he was destined to become any huge mover and shaker on Wall Street.
He grew up feeling somewhat deprived, since he would have liked to be able to go on to postgraduate studies. He felt socially frustrated because he knew he could never belong to high society. His father had some professional problems, and so he was bent on a sort of societal revenge.
Madoff only possessed 2 diplomas, a lifeguard certificate and a bachelor's degree in political science. He married Ruth, a girl he met in high school who was outgoing, funny, and much less shy than he was. They got married in the town in Queens where they came from, Laurelton, and moved to a small flat in Bayside, Queens. Madoff, however, already aspired to greater things. Thanks to his father-in-law, an accountant, he created his first client portfolio. Madoff, therefore, could open an investment firm at the age of 22, although he was still employed as a lifeguard on the beaches of Long Island.
He really worked from the ground up, starting a small business, trading these stocks that were off exchange. And actually from that, he actually became an important and pretty innovative person in the securities industry. A lot of the things that we actually celebrate, both in the United States but globally, in terms of making stocks easier to trade and cheaper to trade off exchange, were because of innovations that occurred at Bernie Madoff's firm. And so he created this incredibly successful brokerage firm. At one point, it was actually trading 10% of all the New York Stock Exchange listed shares at his firm.
It's the kind of story Americans love. A lifeguard who becomes one of the kings of Wall Street.
Although his company did very well, he wanted even more.
He was a very good broker. He made a lot of money because he computerized a certain number of tasks that were being done manually. His firm grew, but he was only a trader, a minor profession somewhat looked down upon by the important financial establishments. He knew he was seen as an implementer and not a creator.
This frustration encouraged Madoff to diversify in his attempt to enter the world of investors. Among the first to understand that thanks to computers, the stock market would never be the same. He participated in the founding of the Nasdaq, the first totally computerized electronic market.
He rose up the Wall Street ladder and became vice president of the Nasdaq, and thus became a major player who had the confidence of the market's financial institutions.
Madoff had a whole laundry list of different chairmanships. NASDAQ, one of the major security dealer organizations. That laundry list can go on. He was at one point over-the-counter man of the year, one of the highest paid exec. We could create a whole CV of accolades that Bernie Madoff received.
He was in a world when no one suspected him. As part of the system's inner workings, he was beyond suspicion.
Madoff obtained authentic legitimacy on Wall Street and the recognition of his peers. His primary motivation, however, was not the money.
I don't think he was that greedy, because when you look at the money he redistributed before his downfall, you see that he sometimes used his own savings. That wasn't his mechanism. He had a sort of detachment concerning money, which was one of the keys to his swindle. To him, money, after all, is only money.
He was privileged. I think when it comes to money, I mean, he was at a level, like many prominent white-collar offenders, where money doesn't really matter anymore. He was still considered one of the higher-paid individuals on Wall Street. He lived a very, very comfortable life. And so the question is, was it for money? I don't think it was money. Was it for prestige or fame? He actually didn't get a lot of accolades, you could say, from in a public set. It was from the investors he was actually working for that did appreciate him.
Imbued with his success, Madoff set up his empire over 3 floors in the Lipstick Building. The 18th and 19th floors were for brokerage, but the 17th, nicknamed the Cage, was reserved for his illegal activities concerning his investment fund.
The separation of Madoff's legitimate market-making business from the floor in which he had his Ponzi scheme was very deliberate and almost like a Chinese wall, separated. Madoff had his Ponzi scheme effectively operating on an outdated IBM, producing fake reports and phony confirmations of trades. And so the two employees, groups of employees, would not intersect with each other. There was really stereo silence.
Throughout his ascension, Madoff believed so strongly in his lucky star that nothing could stop the infernal spiral in which he was engaged, something he half admits to.
Because of the success I had, and because I was sort of always going up against difficult odds, I probably didn't think long and hard enough about some of the things that I did, like, getting into the problem where I started to go off the tracks, and I was able to convince myself that this was, a temporary situation, and because of all my success, I sort of was going to be able to continue to do that, and probably, just didn't give it enough thought.
His success duped even the Security and Exchange Commission. Not only did Madoff gain its confidence, he even became their main consultant on financial transparency and control rules, and participated shamelessly in all their meetings.
And I genuinely believe that most practitioners in the marketplace want to comply with the rules. They're not trying to disadvantage anybody.
Madoff was able to work with the people at the SEC and tell them what had to be done. And they would pass regulations that he told them to pass. In my opinion, that's not just a mistake. That's someone controlling the investigation and protecting Madoff.
He was trusted, and that relationship of trust enabled him to not be scrutinized as thoroughly as he should have been. He was investigated something like 10 to 12 times.
The SEC's investigations, however, yielded nothing, and for a good reason. Investigators never went up to the 17th floor, the offices of Madoff's secret investment fund. He could always count on the nearsightedness of the authorities and of his employees, who didn't seem to be aware of the scam.
He rewarded his employees well, so that way they wouldn't speak. He kept them deliberately in the dark.
Paradox is that a lot of people thought he was a nice person. He was generous to his staff. But obviously, someone who had empathy for other human beings could not have done what he did.
His well-oiled system enabled him to live a luxurious life, totally free of guilt or shame. He owned a penthouse apartment near Central Park, a villa on Long Island, another at Palm Beach, and a yacht. He frequented the hotel bars in the finance district.
Hi, Mr. Madoff, welcome back. Good to see you, sir.
And was invited to all the high society events and charity galas. He went to the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach regularly, behaving like a prince and not wanting to be disturbed by unimportant people. And yet, how did his victims view him? Was he a big spender?
He didn't have the chic of a certain number of finance professionals, nor the arrogance, or the $10,000 suits. He wasn't like that, and that was one of the keys to his swindle, because when you see someone who's a big spender, you feel he's doing so with your money. Most of his victims considered Madoff to be a good and rigorous manager, because they felt that the commissions he earned through them were not being wasted, which they thought was a healthy sign.
In addition, he and his wife's favourite dining place was a simple, friendly and unpretentious Italian restaurant, La Primola. They would always arrive at 6:30 in the evening, ask, for him, chicken and glass of red wine. He drank very little alcohol. And for her, fish. They would stay there for an hour and leave a normal 20% tip. They had a very pleasant daily lifestyle, but without any frenetic spending.
The Madoffs were wealthy people. They had multiple homes, they had shares in a jet, they had yachts. However, if you also think about the hedge fund managers at this time, the type of wealth that they had, the Madoffs were not extraordinarily different or more lavish. They led, by hedge fund standards, a relatively modest life.
And so, what was Madoff's true nature? What went on inside his head while he was cheating his victims? Beyond societal revenge, what motivated him?
He was an agitator, and he was someone who would master all the elements of his fiction to such a point that he believed it. The moment he aspired to greatness and the domination of the sector was the moment that the madness of speculation took over.
Madoff adopted an imperial attitude, considering himself above the norm, something he readily admits to.
Just being able to sort of succeed in that, and then, all of a sudden having, a mindset where you feel you can almost accomplish, anything. And I built my confidence up to a level where I felt that, there was nothing that I couldn't attain, and it became like a challenge for me to sort of go up against the establishment and try and break into the business.
Nothing he could not attain, a cold-hearted monster. Journalists and psychologists have suggested a number of hypotheses. A psychopath, a schizophrenic, a sociopath. Which pathology does he suffer from?
I think that there are certain indicators of psychopathy, one of which is a manipulative, charming personality that conceals an ulterior motive. Another is pathological lying. However, we can find these types of behaviors in many people who do not engage in crimes, who are simply good business people. That's part of the game. He certainly has been a little bit obsessive compulsive. For example, he could not have the blinds improperly closed in his office. He had to have the color schemes a certain way.
He's somewhat schizophrenic in the sense that he felt trapped, which is what he thought when his scheme was no longer functioning. What he did, though, was go even further in his illegal operations by going global and gathering even more funds to serve his interests, and so that nobody would discover his scam.
A disorderly desk, erasures, or lowered shutters could infuriate Madoff. Although he presented himself as a gentle and warm person, Uncle Bernie was found to be distant, maniacal, and calculating.
I've met Bernard Madoff 2 times. He's quiet, did not seem to want to talk very much, was not very engaging when I met him. Not chatty, as we say. So it's not the kind of guy that would come up and slap your back and say, "Hey, pal, let's have a drink together." Somebody even told me one time that he did not like going to the Palm Beach Country Club that much because everybody wanted to talk to him about the investments and he didn't want to discuss it. He claimed that he only came there to play golf.
The polish of a respectable and respected individual began to tarnish when financial analyst Harry Markopoulos sent 4 successive reports to the powerful SEC. Between 1999 and 2008, he tried to convince the Commission's authorities that Madoff's funds concealed the world's largest swindle. His efforts were vain, as these reports were never taken into account.
Unfortunately, as they didn't respond to my written submissions in 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007, and 2008, here we are today. A fraud that should have been stopped at under $7 billion in 2000 has now grown to $50 billion.
Some clients also began to have their doubts.
Well, my client was concerned that there might be something illegal going on. This particular client got upset when his returns went down to like 8 or 10%. What I did is I asked him, how do you do this? And he said, well, I don't tell you that. That's proprietary, which I expected him to say. And so I said, what can I tell my client to give him some comfort that everything's okay? So Madoff said this. He said, I can make money when the market goes up. I can make money when the market goes down. I can't make money when the market stays flat.
Bernard Madoff always ducked his clients' questions, responding in an evasive manner, until the summer of 2008, when clients became more and more insistent.
He had some very serious alerts. He knew he couldn't pay his clients and started digging into his personal funds. He was up against the wall. He told some of them that the times were temporarily difficult, and he tried to convince them to keep their money in his fund. From that summer on, he sank further into himself and very quickly realized that the end had come.
After the collapse of the Lehman Brothers firm, the financial crisis deepened and Madoff's clients demanded the return of their capital. Madoff had to find $7 billion, which he knew was impossible.
When the crisis increased, financial firms, bank customers, and managers who had invested in the stock market found themselves confronted with huge losses. And they turned to the money they'd invested with Madoff to recover part of their capital. It was at that moment, faced with the enormous number of sell-off demands, that Madoff realized he couldn't continue. The money didn't exist. Madoff knew then that it was all over and that the bubble was about to burst.
On December the 10th, 2008, a cornered Madoff called in his two sons who had worked for him and confessed what he had done.
He knew the scheme was going to collapse imminently. The FBI was going to show up at his penthouse door eventually. So I think that the degree to which he choreographed it was very smart. He told his brother Peter first about it, and then he told his sons. They were the ones to turn in their father.
Allowing his children to denounce him was for Madoff a way of protecting them by removing all suspicion concerning their involvement. It was also a way of ending a scheme which was sapping his strength.
He told them this has got to end. It can't go on. Since he was in deep trouble, he no longer could honor his financial obligations.
Madoff seemed to feel that this event represented a sort of salvation, a great relief, as if he always knew that it couldn't last forever, and that one day it was bound to explode. And in a way, the sooner the better.
Once he had revealed the truth to his children, he knew he only had a few hours of freedom left. Oddly enough, he preferred to spend this time with his employees at his company's Christmas party.
He knew his swindle would make the front page the next day or the day after, and that the police would then arrive. And yet he needed a happy moment. He was a cheat who from the outset liked to play a role he continued to play to the end. When you're the only one to know that the next day everything would come to an end and you see people drinking champagne, enjoy it. Play with the kids because it's Christmas here. He knew the curtain was about to fall, and yet he played his role to the very end.
Even during his final moments of freedom, Madoff wanted to control and preserve his respectability. Until the very end, he remained part of the exclusive inner circle of prestigious financiers and was even suggested for the future presidency of the SEC. Arrested on the morning of December the 11th, he was released in exchange for a $10 million bail and the requirement of not leaving his penthouse apartment. It was there that Madoff received phone call after phone call with a multitude of reporters in front of his building. Feeling harassed, encircled and helpless, he tried to commit suicide with medicine on Christmas Day.
I think Madoff's suicide attempt failed because he had no guilt feelings. If you commit suicide, it's because you feel guilt towards your victims, which was not his case.
For most people, this failed suicide attempt was just another one of his scams.
He actually did have at some point some genuine optimism that he always came from behind and always managed to get out of the hole.
In June of 2009, the long-awaited trial began. Madoff decided to plead guilty in order to reduce his sentence. In American law, a guilty plea means no debate and no investigation. He declared throughout the trial that he acted alone without any complicity.
I think it was an intelligent defense, since it put an immediate stop to any sort of inquiry. This made a number of scenarios possible. Was he protecting other people? Was he protecting himself in a way? It seems to me to be totally impossible that the scheme was the work of just one person.
Did he address his victims? Actually, he seemed to have no compassion at all for them.
Did he show any remorse? On the contrary, he was combative. And he said that in a way, they deserved what they got. You could say that he didn't shed a tear or apologize. His feeling was, well, it's all part of the game.
Madoff himself, said that he tried to apologize to his victims. Certainly he told me that he remembers seeing the Bernie jump signs and how deeply that was wounding. But Madoff also, had an ambivalent attitude towards his victims, to the degree of which he felt sorry, but also felt angry. There was an intersection between those two things.
Madoff not only showed no remorse, but he has never even weighed the severe damage he caused. He commented on this from his prison cell.
Or wasn't frightened enough to say to myself, I can't do this, I can't take the risk, or I shouldn't be taking the risk, because clearly I didn't give enough thought to that. When I look back, I couldn't have said no. It wasn't like I was being blackmailed, into doing something, or I was afraid of sort of getting caught doing it. I sort of rationalized that what I was doing was okay. It wasn't going to hurt anybody. It was a temporary thing. And because of the success that I've had and the money I made for people, I sort of felt it would just sort of be a temporary situation and acceptable.
Sentenced to 150 years, he was transferred to a prison in North Carolina, where he quickly gained a semblance of respectability with his fellow inmates, although he considered his sentence as unjust.
In prison, people respect him because he was one of the greatest financial villains in history on that account. He's also a brilliant guy where people can look to for, you could say, financial advice. And so at one point, he was actually one of the people running the commissary, the store. He's looked at as probably one of the most savvy business people within the prison.
He's not as willing to talk about his current situation with me in the prison. By all accounts, he has not had a difficult time of it. It's a medium federal security, medium federal prison. And so he's been largely well received by the inmates. Allegedly, he is somewhat of a celebrity because he's received so much media attention. He does, though, express to me his anger at what he perceives to be a double standard between, and I think he has a legitimate, very valid point. HSBC, the global bank, paid about $1.5 billion in fines because they were involved in terrorist financing and money laundering for cartels. Are there any HSBC executives in prison? No.
He will never leave prison, but rather than simply trying to survive, he prefers his favourite pastime, managing other people's money. Lately, he has entered the hot chocolate market by purchasing all the packets of the Swiss brand Miss and selling them at a higher price in the prison courtyard.
It's a pathology as I see it. He's a compulsive, obsessive neurotic. He needs to affirm himself in the eyes of others and make himself indispensable. He very often has an intimate need to cheat, to succeed on the basis of a personality which is not his own. The imposter, by seducing others, actually seduces himself.
Some people nevertheless wonder about his uncommon ability to attract the sympathy of other inmates. Only $10 billion of the $50 billion taken in have resurfaced. Those who profited from the scheme are not about to be identified.
Some of Madoff's fellow inmates are mafia leaders who are undoubtedly there to guarantee his silence. And so, I don't know what he did, but on several occasions in front of judges, he energetically refused to implicate anybody else, insisting, "No, I take full responsibility, I did it all alone. Enormous sums of money have disappeared, and where it went is a mystery."
He protects himself. Of course, they're all criminals, but the biggest of all is Madoff himself.
During his detention, he learned that his son had committed suicide on the same date as his father's arrest in 2010. 4 years later, on September the 3rd, 2014, his second son died of cancer. That same day, Madoff called Eugene Soltes. It was a terrible tragedy, but once again, he did not break down.
The phone rang. This is a call from a federal prison. Would you like to accept? I accepted naturally, and it was Bernie. And this was one that was just really, it immediately just kind of stepped back. I'm reading this story online about his son, just hours earlier, passing away. And it's his father calling. This isn't Bernie Madoff calling anymore. This is a father that's calling that I'm reading an article about his recently deceased son. I don't know what to say. I'm actually speechless. And he says, I'm fine, I'm fine. So on Wednesday, we were talking about Swiss interest rates. Could we go back to that? And then for the next, our calls are limited to 15 minutes. For the next 10 minutes, he asked some detailed technical questions about interest rates. This shows just how he's able to compartmentalize news, whether it's the most terrible, tragic news one could ever hear, or whether it's great news. It happens, I compartmentalize, I put it in the box, and then let's move on. He's lost, you could say, his family. He's lost everything, and you'd expect it would destroy someone. Bernie Madoff never sees, I'll say, reality in maybe the same way that many people expect him to.
There are mixed opinions regarding his wife's role. As she was present every day in the Lipstick building, it's hard to imagine that she was totally unaware. She never asked for a divorce, but her fate was tragic. Her 2 sons dead, her husband in prison, and her own life in shambles.
Just a few days before the whole thing came crashing down, he got his wife to move some money around. A lot of cynical people assumed she had to be in on it. Obviously, I don't know, but I can believe that she was innocent, that she didn't know what was going on. I'm not so quick to blame her. It turned out I was right. I don't think there's any evidence that she was involved. So she was a victim also.
She was never directly implicated in it. There have been lots of allegations swirling around her. She was treated very deplorably by the tabloid press. For instance, they hounded her when she was taking out the garbage or when she was just on the subway and things like that.
His wife said she didn't know anything. Come on. Considering the closeness he had with his wife, one can legitimately ask whether or not she was informed, not about the specifics, but the fact that what her husband was doing was completely fraudulent.
Madoff will go down in history as the biggest white-collar criminal of all time, although his motivations will remain mysterious, even for those who continue to communicate with him.
When you think of a financial fraud, when we think of the white-collar criminal, Madoff is the financial mastermind villain when it comes to this. And it's a fair description of him in that he did devastate many, many people, both financially, but we see the physical harm.
To this day, Madoff tries to minimize his responsibility in the massive fraud he orchestrated, making the financial system the scapegoat. Colleen Erin reads one of the first letters he wrote on the subject.
I'm convinced that something must be done to better understand how individuals such as I get in the situation I am in. It seems that this is the missing link in the potential solution to the crisis that grips the financial landscape. It is much easier to simply claim that there are just bad seeds and nothing can be done about it. I know in my mind I do not fall into this category. It would be so much easier for my own peace of mind to just believe this. Instead, I spend every day trying to understand how I allowed myself to do what I did. Yes, I am guilty of my crime. I never attempted to deny this. Yes, I was pushed into it with the help of others, but that does not get at the root of the problem, nor does it offer any prevention. It is unfortunate that these are the facts of life in our judicial system. The prosecutor only wants to prosecute and build a case that will enable a win. The judge never receives the necessary facts and conditions that created the case. What makes it worse is that in financial crimes, there is little understanding of the financial landscape. I could go on forever, but you get my point.
Bernard Madoff will forever be a legend among white-collar criminals. His unique pathology will prevent him from ever taking full responsibility for the largest swindle of all time. Although he fascinates specialists by his ability to mask his dishonesty, he is paying a high price, as are those close to him. As a prisoner of his own mentality, he will undoubtedly never for a moment reveal what he did with the majority of the money he collected, a secret he will carry with him to the grave.